Welcome to the EPG Pathshala's linguistics course. Within that framework, we're doing the paper Morphology and Syntax. This is module 16 called Introducing the Horseshoe Model. What we shall introduce, in fact, is known as the standard theory of transformational generative grammar. The architecture of that standard theory looks a bit like a horseshoe. If you look at the architecture diagram, you will see this at once. Here is the diagram. You see that the diagram is shaped like this, which is usually called a horseshoe shape. We are using the term horseshoe model in order to describe the implementation of that standard theory created specially for this particular elementary course. What we have done here for the EPG Pathshala version of the standard theory is take out some mistakes that were made in the 1960s, which were later realized and corrected. In other words, we are giving you the 1960s theory as it should have been developed with hindsight. Why are we doing this? It is a teaching strategy. We are trying to teach you a version of the 1960s standard theory such that when you make the transition from this syntactic model to what you need to learn in advanced syntax that came out of research in the 70s and 80s and later, you will not have to make a huge jump and you will not need to go through all the mistakes made in the 1960s. That is our reason for developing and teaching you here the horseshoe model. It is completely faithful to all the main tenets of the 1960s standard theory. In particular, it follows literally every detail of the architecture of that theory. The main mistake made in the 1960s that is corrected in this horseshoe implementation was the fact that back then the generative grammarians had adopted an exceptionally mechanical and rigid approach to the question of co-reference. As a result, they were unable to address the difficulty that only the devil hates the devil and only the devil hates himself have different meanings. The way the standard theory was developed in the 60s, unfortunately, the same deep structure gave rise to only the devil hates himself, applying a certain transformation, and only the devil hates the devil without applying that transformation, which incorrectly made the prediction that these two surface structures have the same meaning, but as you can see, they do not have the same meaning. After our correction, you will find this problem disappears, and there are certain other problems related to it which disappear because of the correction we have made. You will gradually come to know what the correction is. We will unpack it when the time comes in the next few modules, and we will explain the details to you of the correction. All right. In order to understand the architecture we just presented, in order to understand the horseshoe architecture that looks like this, you need to follow a change that was made in the 1960s when the standard theory was inaugurated. That change is as follows. A few modules ago, we introduced a concept of lexical rules. If you remember, lexical rules are those rules which have a rewrite arrow. To the left of the rewrite arrow, there is a category like noun or adjective or verb. And to the right of the rewrite arrow, there is an actual word like horse or run or sad. Those are lexical rules. In the standard theory, there is no use of lexical rules. Instead of lexical rules, the standard theory incorporates what they call a lexicon. What is a lexicon? A lexicon, like a dictionary, is a set of lexical entries. Why did they decide to abandon lexical rules and instead to introduce a lexicon as part of what is called the base component of the syntax, where the lexicon works with the phrase structure rules in order to generate deep structure? Why was this done? You see, the difficulty with lexical rules is that if you use lexical rules and if you keep verb phrases expanded in terms of VP arrow V for intransitive verbs and VP arrow VNP for transitive verbs, the ones that take an object, then you are forced to differentiate verbs into two kinds, and you are forced to invent features in order to express this differentiation. Why? You need to distinguish between transitive verbs, which you will then call V plus TR for transitive, and intransitive verbs, which in such a feature system you will describe as V minus TR, where minus TR is the intransitive feature, because you need to make sure that the right verbs get chosen in the right environments. You will want to say, enjoy your breakfast, has the transitive verb enjoy and the noun phrase object your breakfast in the VP. You will want to say enjoy your breakfast. You will not want to say sleep your breakfast. You will not want to say yawn your breakfast. Yawn and sleep are intransitive verbs. They don't take objects. Therefore, in order to make the right lexical choices, it becomes necessary to insist that when V has an NP sister under VP, the V cannot just be a V minus TR, it has to be a V plus TR, a transitive verb. This was obvious in the very first few attempts to set up a formal theory of transformational grammar. What then became obvious to the people who were developing the model is the following difficulty. It is not just a matter of finding which verb takes an object and which one doesn't. There are some verbs which take a prepositional phrase as a complement, such as jump. You say jump into the lake. Laugh takes a prepositional phrase complement. Laugh at John. There are other verbs which take both an NP object and a PP complement. For example, throw the stone into the lake, where throw takes the NP object, the stone, and the PP complement into the lake. If you follow the logic that makes you decide that a verb is to be specified plus TR for transitive and minus TR for intransitive, simply in order to handle taking an NP or not taking an NP sister, by the same logic, you will then have to create another feature, transitive, with a P, and say plus PR for those verbs which take a PP complement and minus PR for those that do not take a PP complement. And since there are other verbs which select an adjective complement in the VP, so for example, John seems happy, John looks sad, you will then have to invent another feature, adtransitive. Adtransitive verbs being those which take adjectives and minus adtransitive verbs being those that don't. Each time you notice a new sister of a verb, you will have to multiply your features. You will have to keep inventing outlandish, crazy features to encode what you're saying into the system. You will soon run out of features. You will run out of memory. It will become very complicated. And you're wasting your time, because what you're really trying to say is something perfectly general, and it should not be expressed by creating so many different features. You're trying to say a word is inserted into the appropriate syntactic context. If a V requires a PP or an NP or an AP or a combination of NP, PP or nothing in its phrase, there has to be a way to say so. Lexical insertion, which is the process of putting lexical items into the tree, has to respect these requirements of particular lexical items. There are different kinds of verbs. Some verbs select an adjective, some select a prepositional phrase, some select a noun phrase object, some select a combination of the above, some select none of the above. These requirements of every lexical entry need to be encoded in the lexical entry. And that encoding has to be respected when the stuff gets into the lexicon. When it moves out of the lexicon and gets into the syntactic tree. Therefore, it became necessary to have a separate lexicon which feeds the syntactic tree and to set up an elaborate apparatus which allows the theory of lexical insertion to look at the tree carefully, to look at the lexical entry carefully and match the two. If the lexical entry of a verb says, hello, I'm a verb and I take an adjective complement, then you have to look at the tree and check whether there is an adjective complement sitting in the tree. Have you used the expansion VP goes to VAP, or have you not used that expansion? If there is a match between the phrase structure rules that have applied to form that part of the tree and the requirements stated by the lexical entry, then the lexical entry can marry that tree and can move in. The match is working. Matchmaking has been successful. The wedding can take place. That is the basic point being made in setting up the lexicon. Now that we have introduced the basics of the architecture of the horseshoe implementation of the standard theory of transformational grammar, which we call the horseshoe model for short, it is now time to show you, and that way to keep our promise, to show you how so equipped the transformational system can take care of some of the problems that were identified as limitations of the phrase structure approach. So consider the examples of the comparative construction that we have given at 6 and 7. 6a, Ali has as much sugar as Rahim, is a positive structure, whereas 7a, Dilip has more sugar than Ratish, is a corresponding comparative structure. 6b, Ali has as many marbles as Rahim, is to be compared therefore with 7b, Dilip has more marbles than Ratish. The difference between as much sugar and as many marbles is that sugar is a mass noun, marbles is a count noun. Mass nouns are also called uncountable nouns, and count nouns are also called countable nouns. There is a countability feature. As much works with non-countable nouns and as many works with countable nouns. Now when you compare as much and as many with the comparative counterpart, you find that you say more sugar and more marbles. In other words, there are two different kinds of more. There is the kind of more that corresponds to as much, the non-count kind, and the kind of more that corresponds to as many, the countable kind. So in the two sentences of 7, Dilip has more sugar than Ratish and Dilip has more marbles than Ratish. The two mores are different from each other. When you compare these two structures, the positive and the comparative, you find that the more corresponds to as much or as many. As much and as many are constructions where you can clearly see the syntactic distinction between as, which is a degree word, and much or many, which is a quantifier word. When you come to more, more seems to collapse the two functions, the function of the degree word and the function of the quantifier word. This is the kind of place where there's a mismatch between syntax and morphology, and it is always up to the syntax to take up the slack and to handle the mismatch. What we are going to do then This is in keeping with the spirit of the horseshoe implementation, is as follows. We are going to invent a comparative counterpart to the degree word as. As is the degree word which encodes the positive degree. We now need to create an encoding for the comparative degree. The logical candidate is the word which you find in taller. It isn't exactly a word, it's an element, but syntax can treat an element as if it is a word. Morphology cannot, but syntax can. So we assume that corresponds to as. So we treat more, which is a quantifier, as the morphological instantiation of the syntactic sequence more. More, degree plus quantifier corresponds to as much. More corresponds to as many. Remember that more has two different meanings. A count meaning corresponding to as many and a mass meaning corresponding to as much. So the syntax pretends that there is an to the left of more, and the syntax knows that the morphology will get rid of it. In other words, there will only be more. The innovation which distinguishes our horseshoe implementation from the way people actually implemented the standard theory in the 1960s is that we introduce these special extra elements like that of more, which we know are going to be demolished on the way to the surface structure. These extra elements introduced artificially by the syntax for a special syntactic purpose are called volatile elements because they're going to disappear. You can see the motivation for postulating this particular volatile element when you carefully compare as much with more and as many with more. The syntax has to recognize that there is a degree word which encodes the answer to the question, is the structure positive, comparative, or superlative? If the positive point on the scale is encoded by the degree rather than by the quantifier, it stands to reason that that should also be done for the comparative point on the scale and for the superlative point on the scale. Therefore, and est must appear under the degree node in the syntactic tree, even though this separate and est are going to be demolished afterwards, and all that the listener will get is the copy of the and est on perhaps the quantifier word or somewhere else. We give you an exercise at this point so that you can get practice that makes you perfect in understanding the theory. We ask you to draw deep and surface structure trees for the sentence, John has fewer apples than Bill. And we ask you to note that the transformation responsible for getting rid of that extra element is called comparative deg fusion, where deg is short for degree. Every volatile element is eliminated by a particular transformation. We introduce the volatile element into the deep structure for good syntactic reasons. Over here, we have given you the good syntactic reasons. And then we eliminate it because once you put something artificial in the system, it is your job to get rid of it so that the surface structure actually corresponds to what is pronounced. With this background, we are now ready to address the actual issue for the adjectival comparison cases that we mentioned earlier as a problem for the phrase structure theory. Consider the contrast then between Dipesh is more perceptive than Dilip and Dipesh is as perceptive as Dilip. As you see, more in Dipesh is more perceptive than Dilip is paired up with the object of comparison marked by than Dilip. In the positive case, Dipesh is as perceptive as Dilip. The element as on the left is matched with the element as on the right. It so happened that they look the same. But as you see in the case of more and than, they don't perform the same role. Ordinary adjectives use more as a comparative marker, as you see with more perceptive. Given what we earlier decided about more sugar and as much sugar, in other words, we decided that more sugar should really be seen in the syntax as more sugar, we have to now conclude that as perceptive is in the deep structure of the syntax as much perceptive. Why? Because we have to achieve congruity between as perceptive and more perceptive. And we have already concluded that more is really a morphological clipping of more. In the degree position and more in the quantifier position. Once you've made that decision for more, it follows that the as in as perceptive should be syntactically seen as much. Notice the move that we're making now by supplying much. A little while ago, we made the move of adding a degree word to the word along the lines of as much, where the degree word as appears on the surface. This time we are saying in as perceptive. It's really as much perceptive. We are supplying a volatile quantifier word, much. If we're going to keep supplying volatile words, we need a notation so that the postulation of volatile words does not become obscure, so that we're able to remember which parts of the tree are our artificial creation that we have to get rid of, and which parts are really supposed to be there in the surface structure. So we established the convention that from now on, volatile words are always going to be written with a capital X at the beginning to show that it's a volatile word. X is a marker for demolition. It says this word is condemned, it's going to die, it's going to disappear. So we don't postulate as much perceptive, we postulate as X much perceptive, where X much means this is the word much which is going to be deleted. If you're going to do it for the quantifier much, which is volatile, you also have to do it for the degree word which is volatile. So we go back a few paragraphs and turn our extra into X. In other words, we now say more sugar in the deep structure is X more sugar. Is that clear? So now the deep structure of Dipesh is more perceptive than Dilip comes out as Dipesh is X degree word, more quantifier word, perceptive adjective than Dilip. And Dipesh is as perceptive as Dilip now has the deep structure. Dipesh is as degree word, X much quantifier word, perceptive adjective as Dilip. At this stage, we are tempted to write a transformation eliminating X much, call it positive quantifier fusion, but we're not really ready for it because we haven't looked at all the relevant facts. Among the relevant facts are 10 and 11. At 10, you see that the surface structure, Dipesh is taller than Dilip, corresponds to the deep structure. Dipesh is X much taller than Dilip. Notice that we're introducing short adjectives which have the special property that they copy the comparative or superlative material onto the body of the adjective itself. They don't leave it on the quantifier or on the degree word. You need to compare the comparative sentence, Dipesh is taller than Dilip, 10, with the positive sentence, Dipesh is as tall as Dilip, which has the deep structure counterpart, Dipesh is as X much tall as Dilip. Notice that in Dipesh is as X much tall as Dilip, there is only one volatile element in the quantifier position. And that in the deep structure, Dipesh is X much taller than Dilip. There are two volatile elements in the degree position and in the quantifier position. If you go around the adjectives of English, you will find that a class of short adjectives, many of them monosyllabic but not all of them. Silly, for example, is short in the relevant sense but not monosyllabic. Take and s directly on the body of the adjective. So you get silly, sillier, silliest, exactly along the lines of fast, faster, fastest. They contrast with ordinary adjectives like perceptive, which form their comparative and superlative by having a more or most on the left, rather than saying perceptiver, perceptivest. For these short adjectives, it becomes necessary to fuse the volatile degree word xer, but you can't do that because deg is not an immediate neighbor of the adjective in the deep structure. What you've got is deg followed by q followed by the adjective. What you therefore need to do is fuse the deg into deg's immediate neighbor q, so that xer more turns into more. Some varieties of English use more taller. If you stop there, you're going to get more taller. If you don't stop there, if you go further and fuse the material into the short adjective, you end up saying taller. John is taller than Bill. Now, in order to do what we have just said we want to do, to fuse the volatile degree word xer and the volatile quantifier xmuch into taller, so that we get the final output just taller with no apparent degree word and no apparent quantifier, we face a traffic problem. Why do we face a traffic problem? If the fusion of volatile words into real words is based on the feature values being exactly the same, then the problem is as follows. For the adjective taller in sentence 10, we want to fuse the volatile quantifier into the adjective, and if the same feature has to be present in both, it is necessary for the quantifier xmuch to carry the feature plus comparative. Now, if you want to do the same thing in example 11, where it is a positive sentence and the comparative feature is marked minus for both the degree word and the quantifier word in addition to the adjective, what you end up saying on such an account is that the q, the quantifier, is marked as plus comparative for the purpose of 10 and minus comparative for the purpose of 11. You cannot have a theory in which xmuch has these contradictory properties. You cannot have a theory where xmuch carries the feature minus comparative in 11 and plus comparative in 10. This is not a detailed difficulty for one sentence. It is a principle level difficulty for the entire theory. So you need to solve it at the level of principles. Our solution, which is at the level of principles, is to say, fusing a volatile element into an overt neighbor is not based on identity or exact equality of the features that we are matching. Fusion is based on non-distinctness. Non-distinctness is a weaker relation than identity. Identity means plus is identical to plus, minus is identical to minus. No specification is identical to no specification. Non-distinctness is a relation says the two feature values are not distinct. You don't have a plus in one place and a minus in the other place which clash. Non-distinctness is saying there is no clash of feature values. In other words, suppose you leave the quantifier xmuch unspecified for the comparative feature. Suppose you do not give it a value. Then it will behave identically both for positives which have the minus comparative specification on deg and for comparatives which have the plus comparative specification on deg. Q is not going to care because Q will remain unspecified for the feature. That is how the fusion of volatiles can be managed in terms of traffic without getting into this logical contradiction in our theory. Now we are able to account for two varieties of English. In standard English, where we have John is taller than Bill, we say there is an unspecified Q xmuch. It is fused into the comparative taller. As a result of that fusion, degree and adjective are now immediate neighbors to each other, whereupon comparative deg fusion applies and the deg which is also volatile, fuses into the adjective, and you get your output, which is the entire adjective phrase becomes taller. In the other variety of English, non-standard but spoken by a lot of people in India that I know, you say more taller, more bigger, more faster. In that non-standard variety, what happens is that the volatile comparative DEG word exer fuses into the comparative quantifier word more, and nothing happens to the adjective. So the adjective taller remains where it was. In other words, the non-standard variety of English and the standard variety of English are operating with different deep structures. In the non-standard variety of English, which gives you the surface structure more taller, the deep structure is exer, degree word, more, quantifier word, taller, adjective. And the exer fuses into the quantifier. Whereas in standard English, which gives you just taller without the word more in the surface structure, the deep structure has this exer in the position of the degree word, but the quantifier is not more. The quantifier is x much. X much does not carry a feature value for the CMP feature. As a result, what happens in that variety of English, standard English, is that the unspecified Q, x much, being weak, fuses into the adjective, placing the adjective taller in proximity with the degree word. Now the degree word exer can fuse into the adjective, yielding just taller. That is how the two varieties are handled in such a theory. In the discussion that we have done so far, we have ignored the right-hand part of the tree, which gives you than Bill or than John and so on, or as Bill and as John. That part is called the object of comparison. We have shown you already that even when the object of comparison is not present in the structure, even if you have just a sentence like John is taller, Bill is just as tall, and so on, there are complexities in the interaction of the degree word and the quantifier and the adjective that require the full power of transformational machinery. It is not enough to have phrase structure rules and the lexicon. Now we come to the heart of the difficulty. Well, not to the heart of the difficulty, but we move towards the heart of the difficulty by comparing Ali has as much sugar as Rahim and Dilip has more sugar than Ratish, which are simple comparison examples. With the double comparison example, Ali has as much more sugar than Ratish as Dilip. In this structure, with double comparison, Ali has as much more sugar than Ratish as Dilip. We face the question, how does a transformational grammar actually tackle the problem which we have demonstrated cannot be tackled by a phrase structure grammar? What exactly does one do to make sure that the intricate selection of than Ratish and as Dilip is somehow connected to the two parts of Ali has as much more sugar, where as much is positive and more is comparative? How do you do it? There are three possibilities to consider. Possibility 13 is that in the base, remember that the base in this architecture is the phrase structure rules and the lexicon working together to generate the deep structure. In the base, we do not decide whether the object of comparison begins with either than or as. We leave it blank. And that blank is going to be filled afterwards. For the time being, technically, we generate a blank by saying under the node P for preposition, we have nothing at all. Under P, there is a line, and under the line, there is nothing in the deep structure. That is solution 13. Solution 13 says than or as, which introduce the object of comparison in the surface structure, are not present in the deep structure at all. They are introduced by a transformation. How do you introduce it by a transformation? Well, you state a transformation for the comparative and the positive construction. You say if there is a more on the left, if there is an XR on the left, either more or fewer or less, whichever form the XR ends up taking, then on the right, insert than right before the object of comparison. If there is a positive term on the left, such as tall, as much sugar, and so on the left, then on the right, insert as to the left of the object of comparison. That is solution 13. That the words than and as are introduced entirely transformationally. They are not generated in the base at all. There is no lexical entry for than or for as. Strategy 14 is to generate the degree word with a than or as attached. In other words, when you're generating as or xer under the node DEG for degree, you don't just generate as or xer, you generate as plus as, you generate xer plus than. It becomes like the verb particle construction where the particle moves out. Here you have the degree plus preposition construction where the preposition moves out. The difference is that in the verb particle construction in English, the particle can stay in place, it doesn't have to move. Whereas here, the preposition has to move to the right. You have to say, I have as much sugar as you. You cannot say, I have as much sugar you. The second as has to move to the right, to the position immediately preceding you. That is the difference with the verb particle construction. This is solution 14. Solution 14 is clumsy. It generates two words in the degree position with the instruction that the second of the words has to move out transformationally. The third and last strategy says you don't leave the object of comparison with a blank preposition, waiting for a transformation to send the right stuff there. You generate than or as in the base, but since you're not sure which one you want, you generate it with a question mark. In fact, with a double question mark. In other words, you generate than or you generate as in the object of comparison. And from the left, a transformation will supply the cue at the right moment, and the than or as will remove its question marks when the time comes. There are some details to think about here. These are the kinds of details that make up the technical nitty-gritty of transformational thinking. We will let you study the details when you look at the e-text yourself. They are not really fit for oral discussion at this stage of the game. You must still be struggling with the overall architecture and its consequences. We do not think that your listening is sufficiently attuned to where we are going and how we are doing it to be able to appreciate these finer points in the oral exposition. So for this purpose, we send you to the e-text. It is now time to summarize what we have accomplished in this module. Remember, we were talking about introducing the horseshoe model. So our basic task here was to get you some familiarity with a particular approach to transformational grammar. We began by explaining what approach we are developing for your pedagogic purposes, the horseshoe approach. We told you why it's called the horseshoe approach. We showed you the shape of the architecture. We then went ahead and elucidated one aspect of the architecture, the little place there on the curve that says base consisting of phrase structure rules, and the lexicon. We explained what a lexicon is. We explained why it needs to replace lexical rules from the earlier model. Having motivated the lexicon for you by showing you how a simple feature like plus transitive and minus transitive cannot do the job, we put the architecture in place and then we went ahead and tried to apply it to one of the problems that we had earlier identified as being fatal for the phrase structure rules alone. Specifically, we showed you how to handle comparative constructions, and in particular, the most difficult of the cases of double comparison, where there is both a than and an as in the object of comparison part of the sentence, and where the than matches a comparative element on the left and the as matches a positive element on the left. We showed you on the way to this solution what kinds of special devices we introduce into the horseshoe implementation of the standard theory, namely volatile elements which are marked with a capital X to tell you that they are present in the deep structure but are going to be absent in the surface structure. And we showed you in as much detail as an oral exposition will allow exactly how the thing works out for single comparison cases and for double or nested comparison cases. We left a lot of it to your own practice and your own exercises, because by now you will be clear about the fact that you understand particularly well those things that you worked out for yourselves in an exercise. You don't understand really well what somebody has just said to you. It is not enough to hear something from others. It is important to work it out for yourself. We now finish by urging you to read the e-text very carefully, to do the exercises, and to follow up suggestions for recommended reading. Thank you for your attention.